Hi, today we're going to look at some trickier or more advanced ways that you can use Google Forms and Google Sheets together. Okay, so we'll jump right in. What I've done is I've created this Science Lab form. You can see that there are some responses in there, so there's already a spreadsheet set up to collect the data. I'm going to show you what the form looks like before we start. Okay, the first field is to collect an email address, and we're going to type that in. And that's only because I'm not using a district domain account. So therefore, I can't automatically capture an email address accurately every time. But in your districts, you're probably, many districts are using Google, and if you're doing that, the student has to be will be logged in when they're doing this. It'll automatically capture that address. And the advantage of that, of course, is that if they don't enter it, then there's no chance of a mistake. Okay, it's much more accurate, and we're going to use this email address at different points as kind of a key to match up the work with a particular student. The rest is pretty straightforward. There's a drop-down menu. I've got space for lab 1 through 5 here. I can, if I was doing this in a science class, I can throughout the year just add more options. All I would have to do is, come back to my regular form and add an option at the bottom. I can remove options. That would be fine. Title of the lab is a bit redundant. I mean, I could have made these into one field and used the title instead. A problem statement, materials, procedure, results, a value. So if we're expecting an actual numerical answer, that would go here. In some cases, we'll just type NA or leave it blank. So this is not a required field, and then the analysis or conclusion. Okay, before I go any further, I'm going to show you one quick trick. If you've set up a form and you want to test it, and you're going to have to submit 2, 3, 4, 10 different samples over time in order to see if it's working correctly. You can, open up the user's copy and fill it out each time, but there's another trick. If you come to the stoplight here, the 3 dots, there's going to be an option for get pre-filled link. And if I do that, I can take this form, looks just like the user would see it, except now / prefill is appended to the end. Okay, so what does that do for us? Well, if I were to say student 5 at email.com, so that's the email address, and this is going to be for lab 5. The title I happen to know is plate tectonics. And then let me just jump out here, and I'm going to grab some just some pseudo text here, just enough to fill out the form quickly. I'm going to copy that, and I'll just paste that in almost every other field. Okay, because right now it's just filler. The value, however, I'm going to put in the number. So I'll put in 5.9 and a conclusion. Now instead of the submit button, I have this get link button. And if I do that, I'm going to get a special link. If I copy it, and I can paste it over here, you can see it's got an awful lot of information in the URL itself. If I hit enter, you can see that it's saved all of that information into this form. So now if I submit, I'll get all this information, and I can just come up and I can paste that URL back in there, and it'll be ready to go again. So now I could just do something like change this to student 3, change my number down here to 6.7, and it's just a quick way to fill out the form. So a little trick. You may find a use for it at some point. You may not, but it's good to know that it's there. Okay, I'm going to close that up. I think this is an extra. I'll close this one up as well. Okay, let's look at the database itself. You can see that the information is coming in. These are actually the last 2 records here. Lab 5, you can see student 5 and student 3. The reason you're seeing one below that is that I manually typed this in. Okay, or actually I copied and pasted it from another line and then did some adjustments to it. So the way Forms works is that it knows how many submissions have come in through the form itself. Okay, so anything that you were to manually add, and it's perfectly okay to do that. If you had information that you needed to input for someone who hadn't filled out the form, you can simply do that on a line. Just know that it's going to come below the stuff that's come in from the form automatically. And then as new stuff comes in, it'll just push it down further and further down the page. Okay, now we have all this information. It may be coming in out of order. It may just be a little difficult to use. So what we're going to focus on is how to organize this information in a more usable way than just what comes in, by the default on the web. That's really what we're going to focus on. In this video. Now, the first thing to know is by default, it will always call this tab Form Response 1. That's just what Google is going to name it. This sheet is linked to the form, and since they are linked, I can actually come in here and rename this. Just hit the arrow, and I'm going to call this Labs, just like that, just because it's going to be easier for me to refer to later. And the form is not broken. I mean, if I were to paste that in there again and say student, let's see who hasn't done 5. We've got student 2, student 5, and student 3. So let's make this student 4. And if I submit that, you can see here student 4 right here. So me changing the name of this tab didn't hurt anything. Again, I've got one entry below that because that was a copy and paste. And here, I'll show you how you can do that as well. I could just select the line and copy it, paste it over here, and then do a quick edit. So I've got, for lab 5, we've got 5, 3, 4, 2, so we just need 1. So we'll say student number 1. So I'll just make that a little tiny bit of a change there. Okay, if I were to come back, paste that link in again. Whoop. I think I may have lost my link there. Okay, but if I'm not going to go to the trouble or take the time, but if I were to go paste it again and submit it, these two, since these two did not come in through the form, they'll wind up on the very bottom of the list. Okay, it's okay. Right above, they'll become a new 20, and then this will become 21 and 22. Now we've gathered a lot of information, which is great, but it's a little messy and it's a little hard to read. So now let's look at creating alternate sheets to work with and display subsets of this information, maybe do some calculations. Okay, so in order to create a new sheet in Google Sheets, you just go to the bottom, you look for the little plus sign down here. If you mouse over, you see it says Add Sheet. And that says Sheet 6 because I've been playing with this and it remembers that. But I'm just going to rename it as Sheet number 2. Okay, first thing you can do, and perhaps the simplest thing that you can do, is simply point one cell at another to display the information. So I'm going to click in cell A1 of this sheet 2. So just select it. And then I'm going to come back to the Labs tab and I'm going to decide what information it is that I want. And I think what I want is the email address, the lab number, and maybe the value that they entered, which is in column J. Okay, so let me come back here. Okay, so click in the cell. You see it's empty right now. Click on Labs, and then I'm going to do B1. It didn't work because I've been playing around so much. Equals Labs B1. There we see it. It actually says the word Labs to say it's the Labs tab, and then an exclamation and B1. If I hit Enter, I'm back on this sheet 2, and it's showing me what the data from Labs B1. Okay, now if I click on the cell, I always get this little handle, and I'm going to drag it to the right, and you'll see, the title lab number comes up. That's because when we drag to the right, by default, Sheets is going to increment. Let me zoom in a little bit. There you go. So now instead of saying B, it says C, and if I drag it again, it is D, which is title of the lab. Now, I don't really want the title of the lab. I wanted that value, and that was in J. Now, I could just, click, hit the equal sign, and go find J. But there's nothing wrong, once I understand these references, which just with either typing them or editing them. So I changed the D to a J when I hit enter. You can now see that it's looking at the value column. It's taking the header from that column. Now, just as they'll increment by column when you drag them across, by default, it'll increment by row when you drag them down. So if I drag that first one down, it's not showing me the label email address. It's showing me the value of B2, which is an actual email address. And I don't have to do this one at a time. I can grab that bottom corner and just pull it down. There I'm at 38. And you'll notice this one is pointing at B22. There's nothing in there, so it's showing me nothing. The last row we have is B21, and it's showing me the data that's in there. Now, I can select all three of these at once. I don't have to do them one at a time. And I can drag down as far as I want. So now I'm at 135. Most of those will be blank because not that many labs have been completed yet. But if this were a bigger class and it was going on over the course of a year, I could easily reach that. Okay, that's the simplest way to just look at data from the other sheet. Let's create a new sheet. I'm going to call it Sheet 3. And we're going to look at how to be a little more sophisticated with what we do there. I'm going to pause the video for a second so you don't have to see me work. And when we come back, I'll explain what it is we'll be doing. Okay, I'm back, and this is the sheet that I created. I got it set up, students 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. These are the email address of the 5 students I'm using. I put in some names just for the heck of it. And these fields are all typed. Okay, these are not referenced. I typed in this information. And I made additional columns for lab 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. And of course, if there were 12 labs, I could have just continued. Now, just as kind of a point of interest, because this ends in a number, if I were to drag that over to the right, it would keep incrementing. So that's a nice little, I'm going to undo that, but that's a nice little potential time saver. You can think about how you name your identifiers, in this case the labs, and you might be able to take advantage of that. Okay, what we want to see on this sheet is essentially which labs students have completed. So I'm going to click in cell D2, and I'm looking for lab 1 for student 1. Okay. So last week we looked at a COUNTIF formula. So equals COUNTIFs, and I open my parenthesis. And now it's going to look for criteria range. So where do I want to search for this information? Well, that's always going to be under labs. This is where the data comes in from the form. And I'm just going to select column B. So it's saying labs B:B. That means the entire column. And that means this formula will continue to work as more and more and more rows are added. Okay, because it doesn't specify row numbers here, it'll just take everything from column B, whether that be 50 or 100 or 10,000. I'm going to hit a comma. And what do I want to search those for? Well, come back to sheet 3. I want to search for this email address. So I want to search for what's in A2. Let's hit enter and see if that worked. Oh, okay. Well, we've got a number. That means essentially right now we have found 4 entries for student 1. We haven't yet narrowed it down to be only for lab 1. Okay, we only gave it one set of criteria so far. So let me go back in there and edit it. After the A2, you put a comma. You just separate everything with a comma. And now it's asking for criteria range 2. So let's come back to labs and say, that's it. Column C to C is where the lab numbers are. Comma. And, oh, I have this nice header here. You can't see it. It's blocked a little bit. But this cell D1 is where it says lab 1. So now the formula says count it only if in the email address it's student 1, and in the column for lab name it's lab 1. And when I hit enter, I now get the 1 that I would be expecting. Now if I go to copy this down, it's going to get a little funky. it seems like probably some other people completed the labs, and so why isn't this working? The reason is, remember, it increments. And now we don't want it to increment for certain things. When I'm dragging down, I don't want that reference to D1 to change. I always want it to be D1. Now we can click on that and hit our F4 key on the keyboard, and that's going to lock in that D1. So now the reference is always going to be D1. However, the references to the emails will increment, and we'll count up, and that's exactly what I want. I want this cell to check for student 2, this cell to check for 3, this for 4. Now let me come over here and pull over for lab 2. Oops, sorry. See if I can copy this formula over into this cell. And I believe I did have a student 1 in lab 2, so why is this not working? Well, same type of thing. This formula now says check labs CC for B2. So now it's looking for Sandy, and it's looking in the lab number for that. So I really didn't want all of that to increment. Okay, so let's fix that up now. Column BB, will that always be our email column in the lab sheet? Yes, it will. So I am going to lock that in totally. Make that an absolute reference. Will column C, C to C, always contain the lab numbers? So yes, we're going to do F4 there. So we've locked in the 2 references to our columns on the lab sheets. Now let's think about this A2 for a second. This A2 is this lab. Yeah, we don't want A2 actually. This is A3. This is A2. The A2, yes, we do want them to increment down in rows, but we always want them to refer to column A. So in this case, we're going to put a $sign in front of the A, but not in front of the 2. Okay, you'll see why in just a second. When I pull this down, of course, everything still works. But when I pull it across, the A is going to remain the same. As a matter of fact, A2 is going to remain the same. So this will continue to look at A2 for email address. Last thing we have to look at is this thing that we locked in here, this D1. Well, if I drag it across now, the problem with this is it's still looking back at D1. It's not looking for E1. So what I should have done here is I should have locked in the row. You should always look at row 1 no matter what. You should never start looking down the list. But I don't need to lock in the D, so that now when I pull it across and copy this equation across, it's now looking at E1. This is looking at F1, this is looking at G1, this is looking at H1. Okay, so the way you lock in your absolute references is very, very important. You can, of course, just manually change them, but when you get a lot of data and a lot of fields, you'd really like to kind of think it through. And if you make a mistake, it's no big deal. All I have to do is fix it, copy it down, and then copy it across. And now that's showing me right away which labs are missing. Now I'm going to take these 5 lab fields and I'm going to shrink them down a little bit. And I am going to create 5 new lab fields. Because the 1s and the 0s are nice, they give me the information that I want, but maybe I'd like it in a more usable format. Maybe I'd like it a little more friendly. Okay, so I can take lab 1 here and I can say, go back to one of our if statements. If this cell, got my equal sign there, equals, if this cell equals 1, now I have to give it what I want it to do if that statement is true. Refresher from last week. Well, if it's true, just show me the word complete. And I have to put that in quotes because it's text. And then I put a comma, and what am I going to do if it's false? You know what? I could put incomplete in there if I want, but I think I'm just going to leave it blank. So to leave it blank, I'm going to open a quote and close a quote. And now you can see that, yes, lab 1, instead of displaying 1, it's displaying complete. Now, these references, let's see, do they need to be locked in? When I drag down, I want it to refer to the next row and the next row and the next row. And when I drag across, I want it to refer to the next column and the next column and the next column. So in this case, we really don't need any absolute references. Notice all the ones, all the completes. Okay, now we've got the completes, but where we have zeros, we have blanks. Okay, now to make this just a little bit, the coding is a little bit more complex, but the results would be a little simpler to look at. We did this in 2 stages. We created the ones and zeros because I knew how to do the count. And then we put these markers in for complete or incomplete. It's possible, and that's where we're heading in this, it's possible to nest these things together. And basically what you do is you just wrap one formula around another. Now I want to emphasize that this is not necessary. There are many times if I'm working with a complicated set of criteria that I will build it out just this way. You know, I'll get the first stage done, and then I'll get the second stage done, and then I'll get the third stage done if necessary. As a matter of fact, if you left it this way and you didn't like these ones and zeros, you could select those columns, right click, and simply hide them. Okay, so now I'm getting the results that I want, and no one, I don't have to look at the earlier stage. Okay, but I want to show you this for those of you who might want to take it to the next level, or maybe if you like this and you start playing with it 6 months down the road, or sometime down the road, you decide that you want to try this next level. So first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to look at cell D2 and I'm going to click in there. That's the first place I really have one of these formulas. Let's refresh on what this formula actually does. Because it checks this other tab and it looks for instances where this student has submitted something marked as Lab 1. And it does that for each student. And then it counts them up. So our data looks very clean. We have zeros and ones. So either it finds them or it doesn't. There's another scenario there that we'll come back to in a minute. But for right now, let's just keep it simple and deal with the zeros and ones. So this formula is just counting up instances of this combination. And right now we have 1 if it finds it, and we have 0 if it doesn't. So all I have to do is ask a question against this formula. I'm going to say if, and I'm going to open a parentheses. So if the results of what I already have in there are equal to 1, I'm going to put a comma now. So if they're equal to 1, what do I do? And in quotes, here's where I put complete. So you can see that I'm taking this if statement and I'm just putting it around this statement that I already worked out. I'm just asking if that's equal to 1 and then wrapping this if around it and saying if it is, yeah, put the word complete. Now I'm putting a comma, open and close quotes, so it displays nothing, and close it. Okay, I hit enter. And now you can see that it comes back with the word complete because there was a 1 in that box. Very easy. That formula will increment well, so you just copy it down, copy it across, and then no need for these additional columns. I'm just going to dump them. Now, what we didn't account for is what happens if somebody does an extra submission or something along those lines. Well, that would be a pretty simple fix. Instead of saying equal to 1, all we would have to say here is greater than 0. Okay, very simple logical fix. Now if it's a 1, a 2, a 50, a 70, whatever, it'll still come back with complete. The only condition that it will leave it blank for is if it doesn't find any matches whatsoever. Okay, that all takes some time and practice to get everything working correctly. What I would suggest is, when you have data and you're collecting it, it's a large amount, um, or it's long term or something like that. Think about think about what results you want from that. How do you want to look at that data? And then from there, you try to derive methods of counting, summing, averaging, doing filtering, doing whatever it is you need to get those results. And then you can set them up automatically. The nice thing about this is that, as I said, it works for 5 students. To make it work for 500 students, probably take me less than a minute. To make it work for 50 labs would probably take me 10 minutes. Once you get it worked out, it's very easy to expand. And then next year, when I come back, all I have to do is dump the data from here and let that form keep filling it up. Okay. A couple of things here. You've got sheets along the bottom. One of the options you have here, I should have done this one before, is you can always just hide them. So if it's not something you're using, or if it's something you want to come back to, maybe you're sharing this with students, you can just hide the sheets. Okay, we're going to look at one other method of interacting with this data. So on sheet 2, we just kind of pointed across at the other sheet with this by referencing another cell and pulled the information across that way. Okay, on sheet 3, we used formulas and calculations displaying on this sheet, but pointing back at the other sheet in order to do it. So it gives you a nice, neat, clean view of the results, as opposed to looking at all that raw data. Okay, we're going to create one more sheet here, and we're going to make that sheet 4. Okay. And this time we're going to approach it from a totally different angle. We're going to click in cell A1, and we're going to do something called a query. So we're going to say equals query, and we're going to open the parentheses. And you can see now that it's asking me for the data. What data set is it that I want to query? So I can go to labs, and I'm going to click on cell A. So now you can see it's querying A to A. But I'm just going to drag this across here. Okay. I got all of it, but I messed it up, so now it says A1 to K1. Well, that's easy enough. I'm just going to delete the ones in both cases and put a comma. So now it's saying that it's querying everything on this page. Again, because the reference no longer includes a number, it doesn't matter how many records are in here now, because every time a record is added, the query is still going to pick it up. It's querying the whole column. And now it's asking, what are you looking for? This needs to go between quotes, and I'm just going to close that up. This is where most of the work gets done, right in here, and where you have to learn a little bit about how to use it. The term is always going to be select. Select means get the stuff. In this particular case, I'm going to start out simple, and I'm just going to put an asterisk. The asterisk means select everything. Let's hit enter and see if our query is working. Now I am on sheet 4. Sheet 4 looks exactly like labs. That's because I'm querying it and I'm telling it to select everything. Okay. I am going to come back to labs for a second, and I'm going to do something to make my life easier. I am going to say format. Nope, I'm sorry. I'm going to say data, something called a named range. And I'm going to add a range. I'm going to call this labs. Or I could call it labs data. If naming it the same as the tab is confusing, then name it something else, but name it something similar. Labs data. Okay? And now I'm going to select the range for this. And I'm going to do just what I did before. I'm going to select all the columns. What was it up to? There it is, K. So A through K, and I'm going to say OK. And I'm going to say done. Now, all I've really done is taken that entire set of data, and instead of having to always select labs A to K or something like that, I've just given it a name called labs data. So if I come back to my sheet 4 here, I could replace that. And as a matter of fact, when I start to type it, it shows me this little symbol, and it shows me that I have this named range, labs A to K. So I'm just going to select that. So that's just a little tip there, is if you need something like that, you can give it a friendlier name. Now note that these are a little mixed up. They're showing by timestamp, but it looks like lab 1 came in after lab 2 sometimes, and here's some lab 5s and then a lab 4. So next thing that I can do with this select statement, there's another clause I can add called order by, space, and this is column A, B, it's column C, so I'm just going to say order by C. Now something weird happened. It looked like all my data disappeared, but it's actually in the order I asked for. There's just all these blank lines here. Okay, and there's an interesting reason for that. It's looking at some of these blank lines in here as having data more or less. It's ordering them, and it's counting the blanks to come first, which is a little odd. Okay, so the way that we handle that, this little phrase that has to go in there. Don't worry, there's a couple of more things to learn, and then after that it gets simpler. There's a statement called where. As a matter of fact, it doesn't have to be capital. And what I'm looking for is, I can use any column. I could use column A, B, C. You know, my information in here comes across in full rows. So I'm just going to say where A is not null. And now I've gotten rid of all those blank lines at the top. So all that's saying is look over here and get me only the rows where A is not blank. Now, an alternative move that you could do, which is not honestly a bad idea when you set up a form for Google, it gives you these, 100 or so rows by default. But you don't necessarily need them. I could come in here and select these extra rows, right-click on them, and delete them. And that's not going to hurt anything, because the next form that's submitted, it will create a row for it. Then we only have rows for that are filled with data, and we don't have those blank rows. Okay, so let's see. Now, I don't have to display everything like this. I've selected lab data, but maybe I only want to see email address, number, and title. Well, they're in columns B, C, and D. So from that set, I can just replace that asterisk with B, C, D. And now I'm only looking at that. Okay. Now, know also that if you've selected this information, or I'm going to come over here. K is the last column that contains information from, I'm just going to put a space in L here just to get rid of this mess. That's just hiding it. It's still there. If we click here, it's all still there. Okay. I can add my own information into the original sheet by adding additional columns. Oop. I guess I didn't get enough of those blanks there. Let me get those there, just to make my life a little simpler. Okay. Okay. Maybe I have a column called accepted, whether I accept their entry or not. And that's going to be a yes or a no. So I will say Y here. I'm just going to copy that down. Most of these are going to be accepted. This is going to be no. Let me do something where I can see. One of these labs ones, there's 5 of them, so one of these is not going to be accepted. I'll make sure. I'm going to put a rating in here, and I'm going to call this good. And let's get good in all of them, but that one says fair. This one says fair. This one says poor. And this one says excellent. Okay, so basically anything you need that makes sense. The whole trick with adding these extra columns, and again, this is the form that receives the data. The whole trick to doing this is that you don't want to reorder the information in the form. You want to keep it in the same order it came in on, or at a minimum, if you're going to resort it, select all of it and resort it. Don't resort part of this information and misalign anything you've added, because that would be an issue. Now, first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go to my named range, and I'm going to edit that to include 2 more columns. So now it includes the columns that I've added. My named range should go up to M now. And I'll come back to sheet 4 here. And I'll add L and M to my display. And there they are. Okay, I can also come into that formula. This says where A is not null. I don't have to stick with one criteria. I could say AND and column, it says column L. So we're going to say column L equals, and I'm putting an N for the no. So I just want to see basically just the ones that were not accepted. And there they are. Now, none of this stuff is really here where you think it is. You've got to come back up to this A1 that has the formula, and if I just change that to a Y and hit enter, now I don't see the N's, I see the Y's. Now, coming up and editing the formula all the time can be a little awkward. We're not going to go into it right now, but I can actually set up other menus over here and feed those into the formula. So I can make this into a nice little dashboard where I select the Y and I get all the Y's, I select the N and I get all the N's. Maybe I select different ratings and see just those. Okay, so you can see how the potential to build something more complex is here. It's just a matter of taking all these tools that we've kind of touched on, some of the formulas, some of the references, and now this query, and making them, designing something where they can work together in a sophisticated way.